Welcome to the dark side of the female psyche with Michael Tsarion. Here we will be delving deeply into those dark corners of psychology that few have the courage to acknowledge, the evil that exists within the female psyche. This series aims to offer you viable solutions, resources, and potent insights that can aid you in your rehabilitation and empowerment. But be forewarned, this is a series not for the faint of heart, nor is it for the easily triggered. Rather, it is only for those courageous women who realize the severity of the hour humanity is in. This means if you're going to listen to this series, you need to be ready to take self-ownership over your reactions and your responses. Because while women do hold the power to change the world, the state and quality of that change will invariably be influenced by how well a woman knows her own psyche, how beautiful, honorable, and dignified that woman chooses to become. If you are a woman who is choosing to willfully evolve, if you are a woman who sincerely desires to master yourself, your mind, and your behavior, then the information shared throughout this series will serve you well. The structure of the father, whether personal or transpersonal, is two-sided, like that of the mother, positive and negative. In mythology, there stands beside the creative positive father the destructive negative father. And both father images are as alive in the soul of modern man as they were in the projections of mythology. And that's a quote from Erich Neumann.
Thank you. Yeah, well read. And a very good opening quote, actually, because these are gems. But one could extrapolate a lot on that. I just wanted to bring out one overarching point. Psychologists and the general public have no problem critiquing the dark side of the masculine. He just did it right there. He just drew attention to the fact that there's a positive father archetype or male archetype, and there's a negative one. Right. So why then is there a dearth of comment on the female dark side? Because believe me, there is. There is. And it's also historically the case. You can't find. You have to go back into actual mythology to find negative archetypes. You know, Medea, Salome, Jezebel, you know, this kind of thing, right? You're into the world of, you know, what most people consider even fantasy to find it, you know, the witch on her broomstick and all of this. In normal, everyday circumstances, the woman is completely deified. I didn't create that. That's just the way it is. So right off the cuff, somebody goes, oh, well, we all know about the dark side of male violence. Good. I'm glad you do. Let's keep it. But my God, can we at least be less hypocritical? Could we possibly also bring up the feminine and the female? Because we need to. Because in art, all you get is the eulogization of the female form, don't you? You just have to look at painting. You get the femme fatale, but by God, it's buried. You have a long way to go to find it, right? The history of art alone, the history of movies, what have you, you know, and just the normal common sense attitudes. It is taboo to speak about the dark side of the female. We're in an age now where that is somewhat becoming a little less the case, you know, and we are. But that in itself is not because of some real deep need. It's because of the insane antics of females, you know, like we would call the feminists and the gynocrats. So even that fact that we're not going to talk about women's psychology and the darker side of the devouring mother and all is still a forced thing. It's only because of the wild, odd behavior of women in the public eye and the constant, you know, ability to see it on screen that's forced the matter. It's forced MGTOW. Those things didn't come up from any real absolute independent psychological insight. In fact, half of them aren't even there yet with the you know, intellectual insight that would be needed, the psychological insight. No, it's still in a rather, primitive state. So the thing is really kind of wobbly. I'm glad that it's happened, but this quote brings out this incredible disparity. The dark side of the masculine is not even a problem when it comes to conversation, when it comes to themes. And yet we cannot say the same thing of the woman until now. And there's a lot of pushback even on that. So that's what I had to say about that. But do we have another quote there? A second one, introductory quote?
Yes, we do. Okay, this is from Melanie Klein, and she says, although psychology and pedagogy have always maintained the belief that a child is a happy being without any conflicts, and have assumed that the sufferings of adults are the results of the burdens and hardships of reality, it must be asserted that the opposite is true. What we learn about the child and the adult through psychoanalysis shows that all of the sufferings of later life are for the most part repetitions of these earlier ones, and that every child in the first years of life goes through an immeasurable degree of suffering.
Wow. You see? So there you have it. The greatest child psychologist is speaking and bringing out this crucial point that Freud also laid down the foundations of. Look, they're saying, the Freudians are saying, the first 7 years of life are literally a power struggle. That's it. But they're a very odd kind of power struggle, because it is the first imago that you're dealing with is the mother when it comes to knowing about this thing called power, in both its positive and negatives. Now, we're not denying there's a positive. Of course there is. Nature has ordained it that way. But too many times, an unworked mother, someone who may have been abused themselves for her own reasons, is hastening to become a mother without any research or study or anything like that, just acting on pure biology, and bringing into the world a child that they don't know how to touch physically. They have no concept of, somatology and psychology and all the rest of it, all the aberrations. But it's the done thing. All races do this, right? It's a travesty. And they're certainly not aware of the immeasurable suffering. And then you get your Julia Kristevas following on from Otto Rank that say, look, there's even a type of suffering in the womb itself. There's discomfort there in the prenatal period, just as there is other things that will condition the human child's mind, in terms of security and safety. And this then brings up this repetition that she's talking about, because whatever is suffered, say it's all good things, then those are going to affect the teenage world, the teenage life, and then the move into adulthood. And if there's negatives, they too will be remembered and replayed. They will create a kind of a groundwork. They will create tracks, so that later on, if you have a trauma, unfortunately, because you had a trauma before, that track gets, stimulated, triggered. Oh, I had this before when I was young, when I was unconscious. And so now your psyche is ruling you rather than you being the master of it. And then if it turns out that you're also living in an anti-psychological world where you can go for year after year, decade after decade, and hear nothing about the human psyche that's worth a dime, isn't that worse? Isn't your culture now? And then if you also enter into that culture and it happens to be biased towards females, despite some of their horrific antics, despite their deep competitiveness, despite their unheroicness, I think we're done. I think all the things I've just said. And then that way, and then because we're now more technical in terms of genetics and sort of biological science, you get the same malefactors turning around and go, well, it's not me, it's genes. Here's the DSM. My child has pathology. My child has, disorders. It's disorders. And we've got a whole Leviathan that backs that up. It's not mother. It's not matrophobia. It's not abuse. It's not adultism. It's some disorder. How convenient. Absolutely convenient. And you're never going to find a doctor who will knock that on the head and go, oh, no, you're not going to use that. You're a bad parent. In fact, you're not going to find anyone. You're not going to find a teacher. You're not going to find a neighbor. You're not going to find a professional who will ever address the fault when it comes to womankind. So all of these things added up. You see, give a latitude that is undeserved. And it's having a most extraordinary effect. And you know something? Everything I'm talking about is empirical. You just look around at the feral, lonely, latchkey kids. And I'm not even talking about the severe abuses. The police now know of skyrocketing, right, examples of female abuse, especially in the single home. Unfed children, unwashed, ignorant, neglected. It's out of this world. You only have to type it in and look on the internet. And thank goodness we have that, because it is more obvious now. You have policemen crying. You understand that? Crying on the doorsteps of what they've seen. Ready to just like, oh my God, what is going on here? You wouldn't treat an animal like this. So it's all coming out. And this is good. But she's addressing this power struggle, this moment. And all I've tried to do is define it, to unpack it. It is a time in which the terrible mother particularly attempts to violate and suppress the will and identity of her child. Son and daughter. And then we've looked into that, And since daughters were always neglected by Freud and even by Jung a little bit did bit more work, but never enough. And you have to wait until after their time to get some more, work on it, like from the Melanie Kleins. Well, I still think it needs to be continued to update. I want their work to be remembered, not thrown aside like so much. The great Alice Miller, right, and so on. So I'm just carrying it on, and then unpacking the fact that this power struggle, some of its consequences through the first 7 years, and how your first experience of power is with the mother. She is the first source of strength. The father definitely comes into it, but he's later. His kind of power, his kind of strength, his kind of, voice of authority is always derivative. Always, always, always. It's always down the line. And so this then is recapitulated when the child tries to enter the solar world. At a later date. It means that it's much easier for the child to see the flaws and aberrations in the masculine and male hemisphere of power, because it was secondary in the first place. You're more warmed up to it. You're more detached from it. You see what I'm saying? The original one, the one that you knew in the intimate circle, is far harder to critique, far harder to be objective about. You see how things start to suddenly clear on the lens now? So that's why you get so many of these discontents complaining about the solar world when they really got no right. It's because it's easy to kick that can. It's easy to use that as the whipping boy. But the first source of power is completely barbed wire fenced off. That takes what's called courage. That takes insight and knowledge. It's a bloody hard task. Now, you do get it being critiqued, but we know that critique as teenage angst. We don't see it as critique. We just see it as acting out in a delinquent fashion. But of course, an Alice Miller and a Melanie Klein and a John Bowlby and the greats go, oh, no, we know what the teenage angst is. Finally, we're seeing the sparks, right? Finally, we're seeing wires getting crossed in the psyche of girls and boys who are still in the presence of adults, of their parents, but this time they're seeing, they smell something under their noses. Oh, these are my parents? I've had enough of this. And there's just this little moment where finally the parents start getting, stuff pushed back at them, and they don't like it. And then we can get into the individual cases to find out, whether they deserve it or not, and all that. There's all sorts of different, idiosyncratic cases. But this, I'm just talking in general. And of course, if this power struggle isn't directed correctly, and women get off the hook, then we will have the solar world flooded with betas, which is exactly what's happening. And we will have then problems with female bosses, because you didn't push back at mother. Are you going to push back at your tyrannical female boss who's sitting up there in the executive boardroom? Probably not. Probably not. You see? And as I said, the woman has on her side the universal, ubiquitous blame the male, inside out and upside down. Hopefully she will think, I've taught this to my daughter, so we're all good. And then, not wanting to be long-winded about it, but would you mind if I reminded the audience of this detail about castration in a nutshell?
Yes, please do.
Just for a second. You see, remember, this is important too, because it'll follow on from these wonderful quotes. To completely disable, to nobble feminism. We've done it many times, but we'll do it again here. How can a woman who for centuries used a castration threat, and I say for centuries because it's maybe, things have changed in the modern era, okay, so maybe you can argue that this is not a threat anymore. It would be in certain families, but maybe not all. But that's a moot point, because for centuries, women did wield the power of the priest, the doctor, and the father against the little boy for infractions threatening with castration, because he's got something to be castrated. So he fell in line. So that meant that, one, we discussed the fact that, this would then enable his later feeling of immersion in the solar world. It would prompt it. He'd join that world more urgently because he wants to get away from this threat. And so the father's solar world is far better, because the father's not wielding the castration threat. He was wielding it, but only when the mother wielded it first. And then she used the male patriarchy, as the actual tool of her threat. But she's the source of the threat, not the male. And the kid works this out. But my point is this. How can, for hundreds of years, the woman who uses this threat in one breath use the patriarchy as a threat to get her child to obey her will, then turn the page and start criticizing the patriarchy in the 20th century? Oh, that's called hypocrisy. It is absolutely not allowed. It's not only deeply irrational, it is deeply hypocritical. And there must be a screw loose, folks, for womankind not to notice that they've been doing it. See, this is not a male problem. How come woman hasn't caught their own irrationality? How are they not nobbled and bashful about it? We praise this patriarchy and use it as a tool to keep our male sons in a state of disempowerment when we were seeking to crush their will. And if we couldn't use that threat, we damn well would have used another. Right? That's what comes under the heading of what I call the Medusan mother, the terrible mother. Used any technique. But this was one of them. And it forced some of her male children to enter the solar world with greater urgency and masculinize themselves, and then love to live amongst all the ethephalic, structures. And of course, this then means that the girl who has nothing to castrate is not inclined to join the solar world that urgently. She'll join it, she'll go into it, but in a completely different comportment. And that needs to be followed and tracked as well, because it's slightly different. Right? You are a day tripper in the solar world, but since some of the other kids were crushed, and they go into the solar world like the woman, less urgently, more as betas, and so the woman has done even more, the mother has now done even more dirty work. She sent a necrophilus creature, boy, into the world with no self-esteem. You see? Desperate for a cause, desperate to shun the masculine world, becomes his will to negation is far in excess of his will to meaning, his will to power, which was, the baseline. No, that gets ruined right away. You can see it in the schoolyard. You don't have to go further than the first years of school to find out whether a person's will to power is being directed towards something positive or is already, he's becoming a bully. He's becoming a delinquent. He's a little thief. He's dirty, right? Dirty in body and dirty in mind. We see them all the time. Next thing you know, they're gun toting. Next thing you know, they're coming in with AK-47s to shoot up the place. Nobody wants to be around them. Nobody wants to befriend. It's all rooted in this abuse, all based on the fact that the male power is secondary. Why does man not accept this? Why does the human race not accept this? The first lick of power that a child feels one way or the other is always from the mother. Therefore, she automatically bears the higher responsibility. Where's our society on board with that? It's not. In fact, it flies against that. It's simply not being factual and being honest in this regard. That's why, there's authority when you speak these things, even though the world may be against you.
It's hard to dispute the facts if you can detach your emotions from it and just look at the situation plainly. That's
Right.
the issue with this kind of a series. Why I implore women who are listening to this. I know this stuff can be triggering if it's triggering unconscious tendencies or maybe even conscious tendencies and proclivities that you may have that you're not proud of. But if we can detach ourselves from the emotion enough to hear what Michael is saying, it's going to be very hard to dispute the fact that it is as he says. And I have a follow-up question to that, Michael, because we've seen this decline, at least from my observations. So I was born in the early 80s. And, ever since I was small, anything you'd see on TV or in the media, it was the dopey dad and the divorces, and the father was always the one causing the problem. He was incompetent. It just seemed to be this narrative. And I wonder, can you pinpoint when this downhill pathologization, like when it started from your observations?
Yes, I can. If I'm British, I can speak from the British point of view more likely. From 1979. There is a monumentally important program, which nobody likes, but I love very much. It's a series called Butterflies on British TV. And it was written by a woman. It's quite funny. It's a comedy about a housewife who's all over the place in her life. And, it's a soft soap opera in a sense. It was going to be massively eclipsed. Nobody's ever heard of it because Dallas was on its way. Fame, Flashdance, these things from America, Dynasty was coming up. So people forgot this. And I think that even when it showed, it wasn't even on BBC One. It was on it was on BBC Two, which nobody ever watched. So this one fell through the cracks. But this program is an absolute marvel. And for me, it marks a very, very important moment on multiple levels, right? But certainly on the level we're talking about, where woman was still woman in the traditional sense. And although she was vaguely, had neurotic tendencies, they kind of want you to see, the authoress was trying to show you which traits are organic neurotic traits and which come about because of a changing society. And this is what I love, because it's a balance. She's not rich. This is just a sort of middle class family. Her husband is a dentist, so just very, very mainstream, humble, but he's hardly ever around because he's always working. And it's all about her, story of fidelity, and she has these two awkward sons who themselves have just slightly started to date. And they themselves are caught up being on the dole. They don't want to work. It's 1970s England, Thatcher England. So there's all this sort of political commentary in there. There is the commentary on a changing Britain, but there's also this aspect of the female psyche involved, but done very, very cleverly and done very, very subtly. And also this idea that a shitstorm is on its way. And you get this idea that this poor, humble creature who's running around the world, who's really trying to do her best to keep a family together and quiz. But she has these existential questions about her own self, her own sexuality, her own meaning and existence, right? Talks to God and things like that. What's the purpose of her life? And it's beautifully juxtaposed to the fact that you know that this is all really for nothing, because monumental changes in society are on its way that will just obliterate, the individual quest. It's contextualized, and also decontextualized. Here's a woman trying to go through her own rite of passage, midlife crisis or whatever you want to call it. But it's in the background of a massive change in the zeitgeist, which is always hinted at. This is why it's beautiful writing. It's not rammed in your face. It's not explicit, but you can feel it, and you know that this is slipping away. Almost there's an innocence about her. Rhea is her name, the character, and you can see that for all the ruminations and the lonely walks in the park and the questioning of her morality and the weighing up of things, you know that it is like a voice in the wilderness because of, massive greater changes that are taking place. And it's therefore this comment on whether you can keep optimistic and keep some of these traditional ground rules while the dam is ready to burst. So I particularly like it, and the way it was made. I think it was very subtle, and it was also very deep. But like all best cinematography, all the best kind of programs, it's deep without advertising its depth, right? It's extremely lightly painted, but has this profundity to it. And there are other shows like that, but this stands out in terms of the question that you're asking: is there a moment in the zeitgeist when things change, something we could detect in music and you can, yes, in Britain, for sure. There was just a flash, a moment. It would be obscured immediately by the bigger extravaganzas of things like Dallas, which millions upon millions of people watched. Superficial crap, mostly, right? Power dynamics. And this more subtle, stoical reading and rendering of more delicate touch, wasn't going to last. But yeah, you might be able to find it online and watch a couple of the episodes. I thought it was a very, very sweet. And the very name Butterflies itself, it represents transformation, but also fragility and ephemeralness. A fantastic series, really, really well written.
You've brought up Dallas a few times. I've heard you mention it just here and there on your own podcast. And I wonder what it represents for you as a social commentary of what was transitioning at that point in time.
For me, not Dallas itself. The
Mm-hmm.
program is relatively interesting, right? And well made. No, it's more the zeitgeist change. It signals in the public mind a moment when massive changes were taking place. Not just in music, not just in popular culture, but also in terms of, a greater psychic change. Multiculturalism, for instance, was being pushed down everybody's throat at this time. And one of the most outstanding things that I noticed that I personally loathe was what was happening on children's television at the time. So when I say Dallas, I'm saying Dallas, but I'm thinking programs you wouldn't have even heard of, like Wackaday and Tiz Was, and some of these other horrendous shows for children in Britain. You see, so bad, I don't even want to mention it. And they were bad because they replaced some very, very, very special children's shows. There was one on ITV called How. There was another one called Tony Hart. He was an artist, his program. And there were a bevy of other ones that were very, very good. They were masculine. They tried to up a child's sense of independence. See, one of the masculine things that a good father, an alpha father, should do to a son, especially to a son, but even to a daughter, is make him as independent from the system, from the collective as you can, which means self-sufficient, right? And even if you don't have a farm or a workshop, a good father will innovate And these shows were all about showing kids how to make things, how to paint things, how to fix things, how to, build things, and how to show a kind of a pragmatic interest in the natural world around you. And there were other shows like this as well, but they were always focused on making things and using your hands and using the resources that were all around you. This just went out the fucking door. And the hosts were really believable and genteel and very, very, very warm masculine figures. Some of them are still alive today. This was then replaced with what can only be looked at as Satan's, just absolutely the worst. They threw all of these programs away. They threw all these hosts away, and they brought in Jimmy Savile would look heroic to these guys that they brought in as hosts, for these and many other shows. He'd look normal. And it was very neon. The colors all became artificial, neon colors. There was nothing wholesome about any part of it. And it just went on and on and on through the 80s. You just said yourself, you were born in the 80s. Think of all those kids that came after my generation that were brought up on this pus, on this sludge. So when I'm working in the world, I'm aware of who's mostly listening to me. Grew up thinking that was normal. And so when you try to talk about something that came from before, masterly shows, great personalities, they just look at you with a blank stare. They don't know what you're talking about. This is horrific. So it's not a critique of the show Dallas or any of those. In their own way, they may actually have, quite an entertainment value. No, it was just a marking of a moment in time. And because so many millions of people suddenly flocked around those, and the cheaper versions, of course, as well, right? This then it precipitated a change in the zeitgeist. And unfortunately, as far as television watching, it plummeted. In England. It was dramatic. I don't know if people saw it in America, but you certainly did in England. The quality went down the tubes. And I've heard of one or two British actors, mention it, not many, but it had been mentioned. But they're always lampooned when they bring this up. So the BBC that we have today, you see, the scurrilous thing, the satanic edifice, this is where it went wrong. This is where this woke agenda started to be pushed. And what they did to the teens, and what they did to the younger generation is appalling. And anyone who tried to fight against it with these wonderful little shows, there was shows that featured the archetypes, like Wurzel Gummidge, people will know that show. And there was many others, Cat Weasel. There was all these really magnificent children's programs, but unfortunately they were swept away. Written by intelligent, great, they would be in the generation of your C.S. Lewis's and your Tolkien's. We had others. Oh, yes. And many of them wrote children's books, Ursula Le Guin type things, wonderful stories for kids. Helen Cresswell. I could list many. And those shows were for a while popular. A fantastic show called Follyfoot was one of the last. So sort of like a Black Beauty, a girl and her horse, fantastic stuff, right? Really, really good. Always out in the countryside. Very, very, very positive archetypes. And some of them actually quite mystical, believe it or not. There were shows like this that actually had a mystical quality as well. And that was all just abandoned by 1981. And as the years went by, you got less and less of it until it just became total sludge. So yes, I have very strong thoughts about that.
Yeah, as a child, I just think about, because I watched a lot of TV, and so when you mentioned shows in North America, yeah, there was definitely a lot of slop. But one show I remember that was always wholesome was Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, and he was
Right.
sort of an outlier here. I want to read some quotes from him because I recently did a lecture and used him as an example for something that I was trying to demonstrate. Is it okay if I just read a couple? They're about children specifically.
Oh, yes. And I know the show you're talking about. I do like it.
Mm-hmm. He was very much, before I read the quotes, he was very concerned about the quality of TV for kids. And that was actually what propelled him into starting children's television, because he thought it wasn't teaching them values or how to live in a realistic world. So here's some of the quotes he has. Here, I'll read two. One, he says, children have very deep feelings, just the way parents do, just the way everybody does. And striving to understand those feelings and to better respond to them is what I feel is a most important task in our world. And then there was another quote. I was watching his documentary, and this is the only time I've ever seen this guy angry, because he's a very chill guy in general. But this propelled him to say, this anger propelled him to say this here. He said, I'm tired of hearing people who have long ago set aside the concerns of childhood telling everybody what children really need. I'll tell you what children need. They need adults who will protect them from the ever-ready molders of their world. And when we think about the castrating mother, I just feel like this was something he was trying to stop with his show. But, it was a drop in a bucket of slop. We'll put it that way, a drop of pure water in a bucket of slop.
Always is.
Mm-hmm.
This is the trouble. And you really saw it conspicuously. I watched shows, even news shows that were very, very positive, that were all wiped out. For one reason or another, the hidden hand wiped them out. And it was the Masons who did it. There was a very strong Masonic, and also, can you believe it, homosexual coterie running the BBC. Anyone who's in the know knows it. That's from the advent of the BBC, a very elite group of homosexuals. When we mentioned Jimmy Savile there, it wasn't by accident. Okay, it gets very, very dark, actually. We'd waste a lot of time talking about it, but there was some very sinister people involved in this process. And they had always been selecting the types that they wanted. So some of the programs I just mentioned were actually miraculous when you consider it. They really were. That they should have even been shown in the first place. And I really missed them when they finally disappeared. You really missed them, because it was just a slop up until the modern day that replaced it. And it was like an epoch or an era that slipped by. I think others noticed it as well, but nobody pushed back. I've always tried to talk about it, but in my work. But I think others know about it, but they gave up and they moved on, and they start listening to what their daughters and sons were listening to just to go along to get along. They started listening to the crap that their wives were watching, and they just stayed quiet instead of fighting back. So it was tragic, became very passive, very docile, didn't push back.
Yeah, well, if we think about these generations, like through the 80s into the 90s into the early 2000s, that's about 30 years just right there, of this consistent, persistent effort, for at least what I can tell socially, to make men feel shame, guilt for purely existing. And when I've spoken to male friends who are around my age, born in the 80s, this was something that they not only lament, but they get quite angry about, because as one of my friends said, he's like, I was just born and it was a problem because I was a guy. My grandmother and my mother hated me and they made sure I knew all the time. So this is what a lot of them were being born into, was overt disdain toward them purely for their biological sex.
Of course. Yep. This is what I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
This is what I'm talking about. And therefore, that can encourage them to enter the solar world in a couple of different modes, right? Like I said, there can be the freeloader, there can be the day tripper, who will definitely go there, but it's only to escape something else. That's not love for the solar world. That's just hanging out. And very soon, they're going to show their disdain for the solar world by maybe becoming part of a gang or just being a graffiti-ite, and abusing the solar world in one way or another. They're not really lovers of it. They might become a soccer hooligan. There's all sorts of permutations of this. Or they might just become completely passive, not contributing to the solar world, but just living off of its perks. Then there's the one who's been brought up by a much more alpha father, who's, like I said, made them self-sufficient, and they like that, and they want to continue. And when they have kids, they want to do the same thing, but they're always in the minority. But the problem arises because mostly it's the beta males who are still under the thrall of the female power. So they enter into the solar world, but they don't like it. For a while, they're there, but their energy is going to poison it because they're betas, right? They carry with them all of these complexes, and then they become either the chivalric male who ends up being an advocate for the female will. You see, all of this is poisonous. Or they become some other beta that just wants to go around and complain anarchically about the aberrations of the masculine world. Nobody's saying that those don't exist, but there's a story underlining all of that. Of course, everything's imperfect, you know. But these are people who are pathologically locked down in their minds, and they remain under the thrall of the terrible mother. And then we talked about the girl, because she has no castration fear to that degree. She'll stay closer to the mother. We always know that girls and mothers usually stay very, very joined at the hip for the most part. And then those girls enter in, they'll enter in because it's attractive. And also there's a certain momentum, you have to. But they go in, but they're not there that urgently. They go there for the perks. And then they start breeding more beta men. They have no reason to bring up heroic men. Why should they? They're also in the thrall of the terrible mother. Or another group of women might be working out their matrophobia. And then they don't work it out. They don't work it out properly. And they're under the control of the superego. And the number one most important function of the superego is to adjust you to society. The whole of what we know as identity politics is based on it. Quickly identify with any group that's local, that you first join in the college or your school. That's what everybody's doing. Identity politics starts at school. Yes, because I must be liked. And I'm going to test it as early as possible, and that's in school. So if they dye their hair pink, I'm going to dye my hair pink. If they believe in a certain set of bogus ideas that have never been looked at or tested for reality, what the hell, I'm joining it too. The point is not the cause, it's the fact that I'm accepted by this clique, by this subculture. I don't look at why I need to be that way. And also, why should I? The moment I join that cult, that clique, that subculture, a lot of things happen on a subconscious level, right? My guilt lowers, because guilt is only there when the superego wants you to adjust you to that group. But once you're adjusted to the group, and you may even have some sort of clout in that group, the low levels of guilt fall down, and I feel elated. That's why all these social justice warriors are walking around all with big smiles on their fucking faces until you confront them. Right? But they're going around in a bubble. They're actually very happy, hopping down the road, squealing through megaphones, having a ball, pushing everybody else around. They're high because of this, euphoria that they feel. And they don't realize that the will to power is actually a will to negation. They can't even see the hypocrisy of saying, oh, but it's the liberals and the Democrats and the left who want to bring everybody together. Yet everywhere they step, there's division. They can't even see it. So the female then says, but I'm entering the solar world for its perks. And see, the perks are without end. Right? And one of those perks is to feel like a mother as early as you possibly can. It's for kicks, it's for giggles, it's for fun. That's one of the perks. So what do you see? Women are giving birth, younger and younger and younger. It's got nothing to do with caring about children. It's got to do with the high of feeling, I want to know what it's like to be a mom. That's the new that's the new flavor of the week. I don't know what it means to be a woman. I've never even read a book about it, biologically or psychologically. And now, by the way, after the first year, somebody else is going to be taking care of my kid anyway. It'll be in daycare, or I'll have a nanny, or I won't pay it any attention. The thrill's over. In fact, if I cared, would I get rid of the man in my life? Would I have been such a bad choice about that man, when I got pregnant? Hell no. But the woman isn't even taking responsibility for that. They don't know, and they don't need to, because we've got a necrophilist government made up mostly of women who say, no, we're going to sort you out with the welfare. So a thing that used to be rooted in psychology and personal choice has now become a ubiquitous political agenda under the hands of some very, very dark people in the socialistic network. You know, the ones who follow the Marxist agenda of destroying the family. But to do that, they're using the psyche of the female, the doomsday weapon. That's why everything I'm talking about, I'm not just talking about it purely in a psychological sense. It always crosses over to where most of the child psychologists, in fact, most psychologists, never want to go. The man in the white coat is not going to endorse my message because they don't believe in any conspiratorial hand. That's why it's a fight. A fight is on. I disagree with him. And there's almost no exception. Right? This is a group of apologists. Erich Fromm addressed it. He's got quotes telling you that most of the psychiatrists are apologists for the status quo. They really are. They're going to say that I'm a kook and need to be locked up. Women will say, so which girlfriend hurt your feelings, Michael? As if that would cause me to go on and do all this life's work. You know, or let's say that's a narrow, you know, they'll just stick to this, not addressing the fact that it could be a genuine intellectual interest of a highly, you know, motivated humanitarian. No. We can't see that. We have to degrade you. We have to humiliate you, right? We've got to see it from the narrowest point of view. All these idiotic diatribes with no evidence.
Can I interject? Because what you're saying actually makes me think of the concept of the castrating mother. Isn't that a form of castration, trying to shut down another person's voice, especially when it's indicating a truth that might be uncomfortable? I mean, that's what it seems like to me, at least.
Well, it's certainly adultism. You see, all these techniques come under the heading of adultism for the simple reason that the child is weaker. Remember, you can browbeat somebody else who's more adult. It's not going to affect them. Right? You can tyrannize anybody. They just go, yeah, right, see you tomorrow. But the child doesn't have that rationality. So all the irrational instincts that can pour out of a diseased soul, unfortunately, the child is an empty vessel, you know, that can't push back. That's why it's called adultism. But it's one of these injustices that all these social justice warriors never mention. I'm sitting here waiting for them to mention it. They're into every other cause. They know every political cause under the sun they claim that they're into. Communism, socialism, pluralism, multiculturalism, no adultism. So it's like you kill yourself laughing at these fakes, these flunkies. You wouldn't know where to start because they are the culprits. They want to look at something they think they can objectify. They don't want to look at this because it leads far, far too deeply, you know, into the areas we're going.
The Melanie Klein quote, I'm just taking an excerpt from it just to reiterate it here. She said, "What we learn about the child and the adult through psychoanalysis shows that all the sufferings of later life are for the most part repetitions of these earlier ones, and that every child in the first years of life goes through an immeasurable degree of suffering. So much so that maybe people don't want to go back and feel it by being reminded."
That's true. So there becomes an ambivalence now. But remember, although you may not want to go back and revisit it, because of the structure of the superego, you may become even more violent to yourself in a sadomasochistic way because of the power struggle we've just talked about. That sets up a trend, that sets up a track. Remember, let's reiterate it again. The superego must suppress the rage, which is legitimate. Never forget that equation. The rage against the way you've been treated is legitimate. So it becomes part of the shadow realm, which is just filled with legitimate, you know, expressions. They are taboo not only to the parent who forbids you showing that dissent or any kind of resentment, but it's also taboo to the inner critic, the inner censor. So that's banished. Then you have, because the superego magnifies the images of the terrible parent, the power that they wielded is also magnified, which then, you become enthralled with the power, which is the thing we mentioned, right? Identification with the object of your hate. It's a really necrophilous way to go. But unfortunately, we do go that way. Freud explained all of this, compensation, displacement, identification, right? Sadly, we go this way. And there's no parent around us to stop us doing that. An alpha male or alpha woman, right, which I read about in the book, Dragon Mother, they wouldn't allow this. They would spot this and, oh, no, you're not going to do that. Or they may be such pleasant people to be around, good human beings, that you magnify their imago. There's nothing wrong with the magnification in itself. Because if you have good fucking parents, you're just going to magnify their good. That's why it all comes back to the parents. So those people who try to knock Freud on the head in the early days and poo-poo it all, they're fools. Right? By saying, no, these things don't exist. No, they damn well do exist. And then we said that later on, there's a bunch of suppression from the superego because it now must also repress, this is a third thing, the shame that arises from your true voice every time that you obey the superego in this quest to be accepted by the masses, the herd, the mob, the hysterics. Your need to conform to that awakens a deeper state, you see, which then the superego now has to invest more cash, more strength, more muscle, more brawn in suppressing. And that becomes important then to the existential psychologist who wants to know the difference. Are you coming just for a spring clean? Are you coming for us to just mollify your neurotic suffering, your neurotic misery? Or are you here as an outsider who's aware that they have legitimate suffering, and this is the reason that you've come to us? This is what's causing you to have, psychic meltdown. That's a totally different kind of being. So now we have different schools of psychology that are important. But then the suppression of the shame is the suppression of the authentic voice within. There's a tremendous price to pay for that, because this will set up the master-slave relationship within your own mind that we already said. If this is the state of your consciousness, how the hell can you walk out into the political world and claim to be a disciple of freedom? What hypocrisy. And that's why we go round and round in the world, because in fact that's exactly what is happening. The man who rushes to the political world is a person who's just in this kind of inner conflict. He embodies a necrophilous relationship with himself. His will is not a will to power or will to meaning, it's a will to negation. He can only exist because he's against something that, he claims this is the not I. But the whole thing is bankrupt, because he himself is not a whole being. He has not done his shadow work. And so he's still under the thrall of the superego. That's basically it. Right? At that point, we've looked at these superego constructs. But the only thing to add to this is this. If the superego is followed and you conform, you expect that carrot at the end of it, which is the approval. But as I mentioned time and time again, for the most part, you don't get it. There's no guarantee that you'll get it. For one of many reasons, not everyone gets the approval that they want. And so the whole contract breaks down. This thing only works when you are accepted by the masses. And you're the belle of the ball. But as many people who sign this contract find out, I'm not accepted. It's this other person. And when you get on the OnlyFans and TikTok and you're 10 years old, this reality starts to hit you like a brick. And so this is the origin then of the common or garden neurosis that everybody's steeped in. This is where it all begins. Not with the stuff we've talked about where it really begins. No, for most people, this is where it begins. The neurosis that bothers them starts right here. What we've talked about is more deep dive stuff. That's not going to interest most people listening. What's going to interest them is, oh my God, I didn't get those 3 fucking stripes. So now I'm a malcontent. I'm a discontent. I'm a smiling depressive. I have the tension that causes neurosis. But what I'm here to tell you is you're not an outsider. You're a malcontent, and there's a difference. The outsider never wanted the carrot. The outsider smelt a rat before, at the beginning, with the whole thing. He didn't listen to his parents. He wanted a masculine grandfather or a masculine woman or a masculine man to say, go your own way. Be self-sufficient. Work hard. Don't listen to the crowd. I'll introduce you to books and comedies and poetry and literature and music. They tell you to fuck the world. You don't need it. But sadly, we don't have that. And we don't have the promotion of those artists who have that message. No, we got them being condemned. We got them being marginalized. We want Beyonce and fucking Britney Spears. We want fucking, Jay-Z and P. Diddy. And that's what you're getting. See? So the whole thing is skewed. Rotten. So where it starts for most people is that they are committed and then they become depressives. The ones who are sitting down in the mother's basements that they laugh at, the ones who are gaining weight, the ones who are in this, joining the crowd because they need some high. A hysteric is a person who needs an artificial high. Well, you get that from food, you get that from alcohol, you get that from drugs, you get that from gossip, you get that from sweet food, and you get that from joining the joining the crowd is one of the biggest highs of all. Because now your will to negation is being amplified by many others who are just as sick as you. But those people are not outsiders. They may pose as that, but they're not. They are malcontents. They're discontents. And these are people who, if they could press a magic button, Dr. Phil could put them right, and then they could enter into the solar world and be accepted, it would be glorious. They'd adjust right away. And sadly, this key point, is never, ever mentioned, and nobody is able to work it out. And so we have this sort of ambivalent, blurred area where we really can't tell a true rebel from an anarchist, right? We can't tell a hysteric from an outsider. And there's a lot of posing. And we can fall for it. And many people will know this because you may follow a leader for a while that you think is really one of these true outsiders, only for him to turn around and have the last laugh. Because they really weren't. The road did not lead to an authentic place. And so our world is getting more and more filled with these people who are not getting the approval. And with the advent of the internet, this has become absolutely, massive problem because you have more to compare to. In the days before you had the internet, this could be a problem, all right, but it was handleable to that degree. You still had fallout, but it was a little bit less. But now that you have the whole world to compare and contrast to, we see the result. The fallout is tremendous.
I think about cancel culture as you're talking about this and the tribe. And, I think that there is a part in all of us that would prefer, maybe not everyone, but even someone who's an outsider or an iconoclast, if that's the right word, somebody who is very much their own person. I would think in more cases than not, they'd probably want to be accepted for that because there's a contribution that they have to society, to help society move forward, to keep it from stagnating, to serve in innovation and true diversity, which is not what we see in the world. Sorry, everyone who might be listening who thinks DEI is actually about diversity. It is not. And so I just think about how easily a person can just cancel another person. And it's when you think about excommunication from the tribe and the effect it can have on a person's nervous system, like in a literal sense, maybe atavistic memory, if I'm using the right term. That seems an extraordinarily cruel thing to do to someone, to just say, well, I don't like what you said, so we're just going to cut you out. And yes, I know that people who are on the path to individuation, they're on their own Siddhartha road, it's not going to bother them as much because they've probably faced these situations time and time again. So they've developed strength and determination and reinforcement of their will to continue developing their own consciousness. But at the same time, I just, maybe it's because I'm a woman and my own particular path, but I just think to myself, how cruel and flippant is it to just cancel a person? It's another form of just when I keep thinking of the title, The Castrating Mother. It just seems like another attempt to castrate spirit, will, individual, the individual.
Yeah, yeah. No, there's a lot of this cliquism involved. There's a lot of this subculture. This is what is called death by freedom. Because there's a school, the Marcusan school, that said we will have more conformity from the normies by instigating these minor conflicts. Remember, Freud's premise was a man is essentially a beast. He's essentially bestial. And this was picked up, and it was still considered very, very important to the Frankfurt School as well. They weren't essentially rescripting man in any kind of spiritual light. They liked this. They liked this materialistic, reductionistic idea. And they said, okay, but what we can do is we create these subcultures. It will enable us to be having more conflicts. Well, at the same time, we'll work on world peace. Talk about sleight of hand. Okay? They're now going to talk about world peace. Every organization is dedicated to world peace on the bigger level, because we had those conflicts on the more of the macro level, while they at the same time cut us up so small on the lower level that we're always in conflict. But these are minor wars. All right? It's your flag against my flag. But it's on a slightly lesser level. Okay, sometimes you get the other wars that they can't be prevented. Too bad about that. But look, it's better to have more of these local petri dishes, you see, with all of these minor conflicts. It's just as good, and it's more manageable. Because the one thing that we noticed, this is the Illuminati saying this, when they had the bigger wars, it was a little bit less handleable. Things started to come out against the agenda. So we want it to work better in this smaller way. Get more cliques fighting each other, and we, the controllers, are able to manage it better than we can when it gets a little bit too big and too unwieldy. Most of the old world wars, you see, were to bring down the great empires of old. The Germanic Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Russian Empire. They had a very specific agenda. This is how Britain and France got their hegemony and would later affect America, right? So they had this whole thing we can't get into, the fall of the old empires. That was all successful. It worked right across the board, and particularly the German Empire went down, right? That was one of the main ideas behind the whole thing. They've been worked on for years. But later on, the strategy changed. Those large, unwieldy conflicts had served their purpose. They became less and less important. What became more important is these internecine conflicts, which are more manageable. And somebody had come up with, I don't know who it was, right? They came up with this idea, and that's been the new geopolitical strategy. These Brzezinskis, these Kissingers, you don't know whose brain was behind it. Harold Lasky, one could speculate. There's 101 names, that one could bring up. It's really a separate subject. But the formula works, and they wheel it out again and again. There's always a new dissection you can make, and here's another split, right? We got the racial one, that's obvious. Then you got male and female. That was another one that came up, with the first wave of feminism, and it's just spiraled out of control. Now you got gays and lesbians and queers and just the whole thing. And now you got, others. It's never going to stop. Gays and lesbians don't really have much traction. They don't have much interaction one to the other, you see. So everything is all split. And this is the way they want us. Fragmentation, unbelievable, until you can't work out who you are, what you belong to. And so there's a deeper sense of alienation. And while you are part of the subculture, you're in it with an extreme sense of belonging, right? So it works two ways. Later on, you might become very, very alienated, but during the time that you're part of one of these cliques, it's really you against the world. That's why you see a certain different passion, with the BLM and Tifa and these flunkies, right, running around. They're so bug-eyed because the smaller the group, they've noticed a quirk in human nature. The more that you are a fan base of a certain such and such, you are much more vehement, and so that's what you're getting. And that's why now with the social media, one push of the button and everybody knows where to go. They all know what university to flock around. They all know which protest to turn up at. This is highly financed. And I don't know, we don't know if it's ever going to stop. We really don't. There's been some good indicators that look like something might happen, where some of these groups might be dispersed. But, at the end of the day, you're fighting a chameleon. You're fighting the billionaire class of people who are very, very, very expert at this. So whether you can really take them down, I hope you can. But it's really doubtful. And also, some of the damage may already be done. It may be so deep in the psyche because this has been left too long to fester. And so the changes that are happening may be just too little too late. This is the danger. I don't like to hope to be pessimistic, but I just can't convince myself. I go back and forth. Some things look really, really positive, and other times you think, no, it couldn't possibly be. It's too little too late. But then you don't want to go too far into a black pill mentality because that's ridiculous as well. So, yeah. And I know a lot of other people feel this way as well. But I think the refuge to all these problems is not passivity. It's to continue to study. It's continue to research. It's a relentless search for the truth. Don't even believe me. Go find out for yourself. I can put you onto books, programs, films, things like that, other teachers. But, yeah, do not want followers in that sense of where you just throw out your own reasoning capacities. It's very, very important not to do that.
I think that's a good indicator actually to just have a little extra suspicion and discernment if you do admire somebody who carries themselves in such a way or is surrounded by like a fog of such people where it's that hive mind. I mean, if you notice that everybody's thinking the same thing, have the same beliefs, you don't hear dissenting voices. And when you do, how do they handle those dissenting voices? Are they open to considering alternative opinions and perspectives? Or do they flagellate that person, ostracize them, or beat that nail until it bends? Just observe, I would think. And you can learn quite a lot.
Absolutely. Observation is what it's all about. The greatest empirical corroboration of people like me when I make these statements is to observe it of a day, down the local mall, down the local pub, and prove me wrong. That's what you have an intellect for. And then look back at your own life and your own existence, and that will also, because generally speaking, most people have been through some of this already. People have been betrayed. People have joined groups in a well-meaning way, in an innocent, naive way, only to find out it's just horrible. Yeah. People have tried to fit in, and they've been broken and made depressed because of it. See, those four pathological types: the obsessive compulsive, the schizoid, the depressive, and the hysteric. They fit into this category. The depressive is somebody who is not an outsider necessarily. There's somebody who is in that state of depression because they tried their best to fit in, and they wanted to fit in. They wanted to be a normie. They were only too happy to be a collective person. But there's a certain detritus that hangs around in this funk. And because of the natural need and the ability, it comes naturally with a human being to self-deceive and also to feign it. These people learn how to cleverly recontextualize themselves, give themselves a makeover to look like what they're not. They can give themselves a makeover or believe inside themselves they're real outsiders. Now, this is a pathological state. They're not. But they lack the discernment, or they are in a state of, that's why I put self-deception at the root of a lot of things. That's why I put misosophy at the root of a lot of things. Now, this will trigger people because these are the masks, that we put up. Karen Horney called it the idealized image. Freud called it the persona. Other people call it the mask. And it's a very hard thing to, focus on. You're meeting people who, for a very short period of their life, have got exhausted with the pleasures of the world. And in that very small moment of hiatus, as they're sitting down to take a breather, they may present themselves to you that they're true discontents or true outsiders. Right? You're not seeing the whole timeline. You're just seeing one little glimpse when there's a sort of exhaustion factor and they pulled over in the pit stop. The world is absolutely cluttered with these people. The New Age movement is almost made up entirely of these people. They haven't left the world. They've just taken a breath. But even their exhaustion is not authentic. This is what I try to train people to see. Watch out. Is this genuine existential catharsis and exhaustion? Or is this just, I'm so glutted with all the sensual pleasures, I need a break. It's like being in 24/7 at the casinos in Las Vegas. Don't you need to step out the back for a smoke? You're going to tell me that that's authentic? Well, that's what it's all about. See, I was in the middle of it. You live in America for long enough. This is you can't but see this. It's all fake. You've got to be able to tell the genuine fake from the genuine article. And unfortunately, most people cannot. They've lost their compass. And most people are playing this game for themselves. Because there is, in fact, the truth that hits you when you're in your 30s or whatever it might be, sometimes earlier, sometimes later, that the sensual world isn't infinite like you were promised. It's actually quite limited. So after all the drinking and whoring, right, and drugging and partying, it becomes insipid after a certain while. And that hits you like a ton of bricks because you were never told that. And also, why would you? When you were young, you just looked at the world like it was a gigantic theme park and carnival filled to the brim. Willy Wonka's chocolate factory, right? I can lose myself in that. I don't have to think about myself. Remember, the self is the first casualty on the slaughter bench of the superego. That's it. You've suppressed his voice long ago, and you think you'll get away with it. But then, to your horror, at a certain point, all these extravaganzas and sensual, sensational experiences start to wear thin, believe it or not, and you're left in an existential crisis. And if you're not looking close at somebody who's reached that point, you can be fooled into thinking that they're on a genuine Siddhartha road. You really can. If you're not testing. We're not talking about knowledge here. Now we're talking about wisdom and the price of wisdom. And appearances. And even the person themselves may be convinced because it's so new to them that they're in this jaded state. They'll go, no, I'm on a shamanic journey. I'm not schizoid. I was a hysteric 5 minutes ago, but now I'm a shaman. Oh, and I need some decor to prove that I am. So I went down to Costa Rica and took a couple of selfies just to make sure, and I put them on Facebook just in case somebody was going to doubt me. Like, no, you can't doubt me. Here I am with Eckhart Tolle. Here I am with the Dalai Lama. And you're going to sell me that? See, people will be bought on it because, unlike myself, they weren't in the middle of all of these people for a decade more. Most of my youth was spent hanging around people like this. In the end, you want to chuck. And then you might meet a real outsider, which I fortunately did. Right. We're done. What's this? Who's walked in. And the contrast is so extreme that even a fucking nutball like me could work it out. And the hypnotic spell, could break when you see the real genuine article. Something there. Once in a lifetime. But the rest then pales to insignificance, you see. But most people don't have that experience, and they're caught up in it because it's all this cliquism. It's many things. And remember, we're also talking about billions of dollars have gone into all of this. It's not just a simple thing anymore. This New Age movement has been bankrolled to an extraordinary degree. These Rhonda Byrnes, these Oprah Winfreys, right? It's massive. It's absolutely fucking massive. These Carolyn Misses, and the latest thing that you've got now, I mean, these Debbie Fords. I don't know what. We've done a couple of programs called The New Age Fraud. People should watch them. Enslaved members, I've checked those out. They're very, very good. All you got to do is go and buy a pair of leotards and a mat and sit in a yoga pose and convince yourself, that you're enlightened. Millions have gone for it. The ad copy alone goes into the billions. Can't tell you how many magazine covers, the whole thing. Billboards, TV shows, celebrities. You think that's authentic? So I can go on for hours about this, but it's tragic. You'd be very lucky now to find the real thing at all.
I think about the state of hypnosis you spoke of, like this haze. And, if you're avoiding your pain, the void, that existential void that's in you, like that starvation, because it hurts so much, it does make sense that, if you're going to live in a delusion, like a psychosis, neurosis, just kind of vacillating back and forth between that, it makes sense that you would want that dream of being the hero, even though you're not. At least that's what it seems like to me. The concept of the shamanism and whatnot, I mean. Yes.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's been abused, as we know, right? And one has to go into detail with each individual story in case, so that you can work it out. But there's a lot of fakery. I have not heard anybody use that word who's authentic, but that's personal to me, right? But remember, buried underneath all of this, even buried under the person who's been all the aberrant types that we've talked about, is still an imago of heroism. Because it has to be. The super ego's very structure, to its core, to its marrow, is the search for a hero. And what we're talking about is that it went wrong. Yeah, but for it to go wrong means that underneath that, there has to be a genuine meter at some point within you, you see, that knew what the hero is or was meant to be. Just because it didn't click and we went down a pathological route. There is something within the ego ideal, right? It's part of the ego that does know what a hero is, even though it was fooled. And it was fooled because you're too damn young. And only on a very rare occasion, by the time you're in your teenage years, do you go through this and what's called an enantiodromia, in which you do switch it out. And you do, divorce your parents emotionally, and you install somebody else there. That's why there's always, kids have posters on their wall of, whoever, George Michael or Elvis, or, you're searching for a new hero, Bruce Lee. And hopefully on this second time around, it'll be better. You actually will identify with somebody better. But the trouble is there. Now the media comes in knowing what's going to happen, knowing that there's going to be this moment, and it sells you all these transgressive figures. through the Cartoon Network, through Nickelodeon, through the media in general. They'll take a heroic character like a Batman or a Marvel comic and they'll twist it. Now they'll put in some dark sides to that character that really shouldn't belong there. So he's never purely heroic anymore. There's a lot of more transgressive elements put in. And so the child, the kid is all over the fucking place. And now it's P. Diddy. I mean, the thing has become really, really dark. Really, really dark, both for girls and boys. This is the problem, because you've got a hidden hand out there. That's why I say you could sit down with 1,000 white-coated experts in psychiatry, and none of them will tell you what I've just told you. That they're meant to be the bloody experts. They're meant to know about these structures of consciousness and how they've been subverted, right? Or how you might again be led down the garden path. They don't mention any of this. Because they have been told by people, either they're complicit in their own self, or they've been warned by the agents of Big Pharma, behind them, Big Psyche, who wave that DSM, and they say, don't you dare. Don't you dare. That's why there's very little existential psychologists around. Nobody will go to them. They faded because nobody will even hire them, right? They're looking at, there was a little bit of a heyday back in the 70s, and that's the end of that. I mean, my own career shows you, it's awful. You can't get your word out. Nobody wants to know. You're deplatformed immediately when you go down this road. But if I went down some new agey shit, like some others I could mention in this movement, and talk endlessly about that crap, oh fuck, you'd be world famous with that guff. And I could do it really easily because I've got a bit of a pedigree there. If I wanted to exploit people and I wanted to put on that hat, do you realize people don't even know the half of it because they never speak about it? I've had to resist a certain destiny in my own life, you see, that I could have gone down and become one of these multi-millionaires, one of these Anthony Robbins type creatures. I know how to do it inside out and upside down. I can do it in my sleep if I wanted to. But it never appealed to me, and I turned down every opportunity that came along to do it. And you wouldn't even believe the story of what, followed when I made that decision. The difficulty, the loss of friends and whatever, a lot of things happen when you make those decisions. When you turn away from that false course. It's not easy. But, for me, there was no alternative, really.
Well, what alternative is there if you want to keep your balls? What can I say?
Yeah. And just try to strike back to that heroism. It's vague, but it's still there. And so you hold on to it and you try to find other heroic people. Sometimes it has to be a pastiche of many people put into one. But don't give up, somewhere. And if you really believe it, I think your archetypes come to help you. And again, you might meet a physical heroic person, somebody who's an enlightened witness who can come in, but you've got to want it very deeply, and you've got to be able to see the genuine article from the genuine fake. And sometimes that takes a bit of time. But see, under all of it, even under the power struggle with a terrible mother, is still the archetype of the good mother, the dragon mother. It's still there. Because these things are archetypes. The animus has been under attack and sullied. And so that was the masculine within women, right? It retreated because it was pushed back. What happened? Women start getting fatter. Because the animus is what? Will, right? Force, power. When you lose it, you feel weak. You become passive, docile, dependent. This is the animus paying you back. So you don't want me? Watch what happens when I leave. You see? It pulls back. Or on another kind of woman, it might take the other result. It comes back, but in a daemonic form, which is then is the masculine, the Mars, but it's now in this highly necrophilous form of competitiveness. Well, we've seen that too. Since the 80s, right? Women have become grossly competitive with men for no reason, highly accusative of men, caustic, horrific. Camille Paglia is always telling you about it, right? Other goodly souls out there are telling you about it. And it's epidemic. That's the animus come back in a daemonic form, not working alongside men towards a real goal, but trying to nobble them. Then the anima became daimonic, and she is the dark mother divine that they claim to love, and yet that's the very one that's bringing them to the edge of apocalypse. What a paradox. Well, because you defiled it. You defiled the animus, and the anima will act compensatorily and come in to straighten things out. Just like a white blood cell, right, will kill a pathogen. So the woman has become pathological. Guess what? Not nature has its agents to come in to fuck you up, to get rid of you. And when the animus went away, and the anima is in control, the dark animus, that makes women ugly. Makes them not want, men don't want to know them. It's all part of it. No woman can explain what's going on. Men will just find you repulsive. And this will then break down all relationships, which it is exactly doing. But more than that, the anima sends you images of female supremacy, a utopia in which women are in control, men under the boot, the female gynocracy, and all these other, where does all the imagery come from? A psychologist should be telling you this. For all the things that the woman is doing in society, there has to be a hypnotic, there has to be images thrown up, utopian. You see, and yes, part of it is atavistic, of course. But this is the archetypes themselves. You never experience an archetype except through the images that it throws up. It's basic Jungian, 101 Jungianism. Right. Well, then follow that along. So the woman is now being haunted and possessed by images from the very being that they claim to serve, but that being is not serving them. They're caught in a terrible paradox that's slowly dragging them down. Not one of them know this. Not one of them has even sussed this. Even though, their relationship with their daughters is breaking down, their relationships with their sons are broken down. But this is what you call an anti-psychological society. You don't even know the 101 of it. So the woman gets possessed by images of a world ruled over by women, in which men are subservient, in which nothing a man does has any validity except some evil lurking behind it. These are all images thrown up in their own minds that they are completely entranced by and have no way of defending against. This is the power of the archetype coming back in a daemonic form. But have they read their Joseph Campbells? Have they read their Jung properly? Hell no. And some people who are writing books on Jung today, it's often pie in the sky shit. They haven't even a clue how to address the things that are happening today. And some of these books are selling, they're quite successful, yet they don't even address anything pertinent to what we're talking about. They're like written in some, ivory tower, unrelated to anything that we're talking about. Yet they have Jung slapped on the front cover, written by these ponces, these degreed ponces. They're all over the place. I could mention many names. Just trash, The real essence of what the man was saying, and he also himself wrote about it in several books quite explicitly. No, they gloss over all of that and go into more obscure areas as if that's important. Here, the fire, the world is burning, right? And they find time for this. If you're going to speak about these men, then at least make their work pertinent to what is going on right in front of your eyes. But not even Jordan Peterson can do that successfully. It's a farce. Yeah. It really is.
I just as you're talking about it, I mean, I'm aware of some people, like personally, who subscribe to Jung, but only the pleasant stuff. And I guess this is why these types of books would sell, because they feel good to read. They're intriguing on a level that doesn't challenge you to grow, and it doesn't challenge your evil, right? To recognize that. So it makes sense that people would want to support that when they're still in that hypnotic haze. I mean, you've mentioned it before on Unslaved, that this desire to want to regress back to the womb, to go back to that safe space where there wasn't challenges, where all of your biological needs were being met. And I imagine that this is just a ripple of that desire, and an iteration of that desire, to see someone, a genius like Jung, but only notice the parts that feel good and not the gold that was actually being spoken pretty explicitly from the little bit that I know of him.
Yeah, there are some terrible misreadings. There really are. We've done numerous programs to try and straighten it out. But remember I told you about this hiatus period, this pit stopping that people do where they get exhausted of the sensual pleasures and then they stop. And there's this moment of fugue. And we can easily mistake that as a genuine spiritual moment in their lives of catharsis, when it is nothing of the kind. It's just simply a breather between sensual life. During that hiatus period, let's say it lasts 2 years, like just an example. What do you do but decorate your bookshelf with Carl Jung's books, some Thich Nhat Hanh, some Carolyn Myss, some Jean Houston, who's this other flunky I'm thinking of, right? Marianne Williamson, right? Some Eckhart Tolle, especially. He's always good for this, you see. And this is all the decor. It's done by rote. You have to have the secret, right? And time we go through this. So this is where some of these names that have been hanging in the air and you vaguely heard about them. And so when you go browse a bookstore, you go, oh, I've heard that name. Hey, it'll look good if I buy one. And then that's what you do. There's a movie called 1 Hour Photo. It's one of Robin Williams's last films. What a fucking masterpiece that is. And you see this motif of exactly what I'm talking about. They're the culprit is Deepak Chopra. Okay, this is the dumb thing. You don't know what it is. It's just shrink-wrapped, drive-through garbage. But it's window dressing, and it works. It's based in the self-deception within, and it's based in, a public image without. Posing as the outsider, because it's a trendy thing. It's a trendy thing to do. And this is very, very, very common. And so certain names, you'll always find sort of rank there. You get your Carlos Castaneda fans, and you get there's all sorts of permutations with this. It's so fake, it's unbelievable, right? But there you are. And it's just window dressing. Let's buy a medicine wheel. Let's put on some fucking, flute music from the Andes or whatever the next thing is. Let's wear a crystal around my fucking neck. You know what I mean? It's just jive shit, right? But we're still falling for it. And you see, the media wheels out a new one. Look at this latest thing with Rhonda Byrne and The Secret. And the whole movies were made about this. This thing was massive. Tomorrow it'll be something else. Well, the real Dalai Lama is trying to give French kisses to 6-year-olds. Okay? Oh, I'll just pass over that. That's nothing wrong there. That's very spiritual. That's very holy. No, it doesn't worry me at all. We've been had. And if and when a true sage, not that there is any, but if a true sage was to pop up amongst that, chances are he wouldn't even get a hearing. You see, because the diet, you've been fed on nothing but sludge all through the years, that when the real thing turns up, you're probably not even going to notice it. There's a really good chance. Look at this John of God. Is anybody aware of the crimes, that these Johnnies are into? And for every time that you get immersed in one of these thinkers, then you're not reading your Viktor Frankls. You're not reading the Erich Fromms. You're not reading the Karen Horneys or the Wilhelm Reichs. It's a price. That's why to me, it's not just a frivolous, I've had people in my family that are into all this junk, right? So, I mean, it's very personal to me. And I've been able to firsthand see, if you're studying that, then you're not studying this. If you're following this goat, then, right, you're not over here. And it ends up costing you very, 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 very greatly. And then once you also start looking into the profundity of the Western tradition, going back to Blake, going back to Jacob Boehme, going back to Pico della Mirandola and Marsilio Ficino, and many others I could mention, right? Going back to the first centuries, going back to even Plato. When you know the richness of all of that, then of course you end up like where I'm at, frustrated, horrified, that this is what was marginalized. I mean, I keep talking about German thought, right? And I do so for a reason. And I've made lengthy programs on Enslaved, about German idealism, about idealism in general. Not that I'm converted to every fucking part of it. This is the thing that demands its own time, demands you to dissect it, to understand it, and find out what was really going on, because there was this conflict, there was a war of ideas. And much of this tradition that I'm talking about was purposely disfigured, re-shrink. Marx took the whole of Hegel and just worked it over. Hegel was dead. He had no control over what was going to happen later, and the left Hegelians picked it up. They don't even deserve the term Hegelian, but they took it and they mutilated it. And he's not the only one. He's not the only one. So I think I have about 3 different programs. Some of them are lengthy, 5-part series on idealism, 2 more parts on Hegel, and maybe even something more to come down the line. And we've done umpteen other little smaller podcasts, featuring these ideas. Not just saying this is it, like here's another cult, follow it. But no, this is important to bring back because it was pushed out to the side. And this involves then a certain amount of psychology, certain amount of thought, just an open-minded look. And there's a lot of recapitulation involved here as well, going back over things. But always, always, always to remember that the role of the female in all of this. In those early years, one's first experience of power was in the hands of the woman. Therefore, she, from that moment on, is an idol, 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 right? Therefore, she has the responsibility. And she can either be like a Kali to crush your heart, chew it up and eat it, spit it out, or it can be this real Venusian goddess figure. And if she does this in a healthy way, then she's not violating her archetypes. And by not violating her archetypes, lots and lots of other things go correct. Yeah, that already sorts out a lot of problems. You will have still problems, but they'll be, be able to surf through those much more easily. But if you set up a dynamic in which these archetypes are flaunted, you see, both in yourself and in your offspring, you're just inviting the whirlwind into your life. And Jung had about 11 women around him, all writers. Anelia Jaffe, right? Jaff, Marie von Franz, you see, and others. Esther Harding. He was surrounded by women who went and wrote fantastic books. So you can't accuse him of just, well, who wants to read him? He was one of these male and pale guys. Right? Most of his coterie were women. Marie Louise von Franz's works are brilliant. You see, and there's others, many, many others. I think they're all listed in my article, Dark Mother Divine, on dragonmother.org. You can read all their names. Many of these people wrote books after his time. Very, very good books. And Freud had his female followers. His own daughter, Anna Freud, wrote some fantastic works. You see, there was the humanists, there was the neo-Freudians, most of all who were also brushing up and fixing things that Freud didn't get quite, didn't go as deep or might have needed to be updated. Well, it was updated. There was a lot of this updating that people don't ever want to acknowledge. And I always try to, bring that to bear in my articles and podcasts as well. You see, I have this personal belief, personal philosophy, and that is there's no need to make any new solutions for any problems that we've got. All you got to do is look into the archive of the past. So this should take a big burden off people's shoulders. There's not a problem we face today or could face tomorrow that all hasn't already been sorted. But because we've been so neglectful, with this archive of the past, we've let this library rot. We can't immediately lay our hand, and AI isn't going to help. Right? The whole premise is wrong from the start. Yeah. The premise there is to replace wisdom with knowledge. So it's already bankrupt from the start. Yeah, you'll have plenty of knowledge, but no wisdom. What good is that to us? You see, that's not going to work. That's not a formula that will work. And it'll be Erich Fromm's nightmare, where man becomes not a slave as he used to be in the past. In the feudal days, he becomes a robot. That's the future of man. He becomes the machine. Artificial intelligence. I mean, just listen to the word. It's us. We are already the simulation. We're already the simulacra. The human being. Our thinking has become artificial. And the roots of that is in the misosophy, which is a fundamental ontological hatred of wisdom and a hatred of the wise. And that is why the error of centuries is constantly repeated, none of the wisdom. How can you look at history and see that taking place and not think that there's an underlying cause? You have to be crazy. Right? That the error of centuries is repeated non-stop by every new generation, but none of the wisdom? And you tell me that's accident? And we got Harvard, we got Cornell, they're meant to be all incredible thinkers. Hell, they can't even deal with the dissent of people like Ian McGilchrist, and others like Rupert Sheldrake. They can't even deal with dissenters from within their own establishment. They want to crucify them, let alone mavericks like me or whoever. They're crawling at a snail's pace. They're policing their own dissenters. The thing is so rotten and corrupt, you thought it would have fallen down years ago. It's so rotten and corrupt that they have to staff it with 500,000 Chinese and Indians, right? Because they can't find enough brainy people, they claim, within the culture. They're probably right. They're probably right. But the group narcissism of the intellectual and academics is off the charts. You see, there's this thing called group narcissism. The feminists have it next. But I'd say even worse than the feminist, who've got it into a pathological degree, are the academics. They even beat the feminists when it comes to group narcissism. There are other groups, further down the line, but you can kind of understand that. Because they're not particularly highly intellectual or with high IQs. The feminists have the IQs, and so do the academics, and yet they don't know about group narcissism and its pestilence. They don't even have the self-reflection to look at that. They're spitting on their own homegrown traditions, like transcendentalism and British idealism, but they want deconstructionism instead. They want Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida. They're giving honorary degrees to people like that. And all these people have told you is that there's no such thing as meaning. We paid money for that? That's a necrophilous society, isn't it? We have actually paid for people to tell us there's no meaning. And we got the Rhonda Byrnes and the Eckhart Tolles and the Oprah Winfreys who've set up stalls waiting for those discontents who are, pulling over for pit stops to sell them something, knowing that that's a valuable cash commodity right there. Let's target those fucking housewives and those gormless fucking tubes who think they're on some shamanic path just because they're exhausted with their gluttony of sensational pleasure. You think that's going to pass for a genuine reverence towards truth? Absolutely no way. You see? Because there's another archetype that one has to worry about. That's called the spirit of the past. See, we think those great Blakes and all those people, right? They're dead. Is that what you think? No fucking way. The spirit of the ancestors is alive and well and is watching. Don't you doubt it for a minute. You see, that's another archetype that's embodied in the animus, in other archetypes as well. The spirit of what went past is never dead. If you'd read your Young properly, people would know this. And those ancestors are watching, and they damn well will affect what's going on. They pass judgment on today's normies.
Well, I can definitely attest to that personally, specifically with the ancestors. I mean, with the black race in general. Now, of course, there's going to be a lot of people in the black race, but I know at least on my family line, like, I can't not hear my ancestors' disapproval of, we'll just say poor conduct and immoral behavior. We'll leave it at that.
No, I agree with you.
So I just wanted to say, Michael, because we have a little bit of time left. I'm wondering if there's anything specific that you would like to bring forth for this particular episode. Anything else? I mean,
not that I can think of. I mean, we've done a great job so far. I think we've covered the main points. We did a deeper dive on the nature of the superego, and I think it has a lot of value. But the more obvious textbook role also then needed to be, brought up again, just in case newbies have no clue. And that was the idea that this superego's major function, as far as most people can register it, is that it is the thing that orientates you towards the external world. And we've looked at some of the extraordinary ways that it does this, right? But in short, it holds a carrot in front of you of approval and floods you with guilt should you defy it. And that guilt is so disabling, so troubling to the mind that you'll do anything to escape it. And so this means that then we're on a trajectory to conform to even the most necrophilous status quo, which is, one of the things that you see around. Men do this, women do this. There's no major difference between this. Some people might argue that women are more conformist. No, look, at the end of the day, no. Both sexes fall to this. Everybody does. And everything would go perfectly well. You see? We want to conform. And our first testing ground for this is whatever local subculture or clique will accept us in. Mods versus rockers, right? I mean, quote unquote. Now, we have a thing called identity politics. And so you can understand it in almost a complete nutshell from this. I join these pink hats. I join these social justice warriors strictly, not because of the cause. The cause is nonsense. The cause is bogus. It's a fiction. It's what's known as a positive illusion. What I'm doing is I'm joining a hysterical crowd for all these psychological reasons. But of course, in the act of self-deception, I must believe that it's for this cause. And those causes are also being cleverly designed by the Marcusan Frankfurt School people. It's by design. It's very particularly done to fool you. And it's also sweetened up with a lot of perks, right? And the biggest perk of all, back to the point, is this feeling of belonging. Now, in the course of your whole life, it might turn out to be a fairly temporary thing. But that doesn't change the fact that in your teens and 20s and maybe even 30s, you're going to go for it. Fuck, these boomers have been doing it for 60 years. That's how, all that does is tell you just how well it works. You know, when they point to these boomers and the older people, I just say, well, that's just because the formula is so bloody strong, so good. It backs up what I'm saying. And then the nuance that now needs to be understood is that sometimes it breaks down for a good, for a good demographic of these people who are the hysterics. You don't actually get the full quota of acceptance from society that you really want, that you actually need. It breaks down. And this is therefore where the classic term neurosis comes in. Very important to know this. This feeling of neurosis then catapults you towards big pharma. This uneasy feeling. You may not even realize what I'm talking about. You'll just feel the sense of unease and how you're upset by it, and how now you can't sleep. You have insomnia, or you have bulimia, or you have anorexia, or a feeling of anxiety or hypertension, or, there's a million ways that this can come out. And so then this will then catapult you to one of the most evil leviathans that exist, which is big pharma. I'm not talking about, the fact that it's helping people stay alive. All of that is great. No, I'm talking about the thing much more on a different level of how it exploits. I'm talking here more about psychiatry. But you also fall under the power of other governmental bodies and edifices that sell you another sense of belonging. Because if I don't get the approval here, I might get it over there. You see? So this identity politics matters, because the blacks will go to the blacks groups, and the whites will go to the white groups, and the Christians will go to the Christian groups, and the feminists and the lesbians and the gays, and right? Like I said, the mods versus the rockers. It's all customized. And it's only at a very, very, very important point when you've gone through a genuine rite of passage where you start to realize how fake this whole thing is, or that your participation in it is necrophilous. It's not really doing you any personal good at all. In fact, it may be holding you from your potential, and you don't want to be part of it, or you don't want to bring up your kids, as part of this nonsense. But unfortunately, that's now becoming less and less and less. And because when you put your kid in school, oh my God, the horror story of the teachers, they are 100% to blame. They don't love kids. These are misosophists. They are the biggest window dressing of all, the educational types. They're really responsible for the whole state of decay. And they have 101 ways of trying to dodge responsibility. I don't fall for any of it. So that was the important part to cover. And then again, pointing out this whole concept of the archetypes, right? That when they're your inner family, they're your inner guides, they're the structures of consciousness. Once you violate them, there's a reaction psychically, a breakdown on the biopsychic level. And eating disorders and things like that are just part of it. Just one small indicator that things are off. And once you've understood the function of the superego and the ego ideal, and this thing about heroes and transgressives, it can be a big help. Because when you come to your teenage years, there's a moment in time where you can straighten things out. You get a chance to depose these idols, especially if they deserve to be deposed, you see, and in their place, find something far more wholesome to replace it with. Some great figures from history, the philosophers, the artists, the musicians, you see, the great coaches and teachers, and select them with care. Make sure they're not charlatans. And allow your conscience to lead the way. Superego's messed up, but the conscience, which is the still small voice, will lead you to those enlightened teachers. Because it knows them. It also seeks. There's a higher center within you, higher than the superego, that already resonates. But since your parents did not expose you to a wide enough panoply of these heroic characters, you're already in an immediate deficit. And we get caught up then in identifying with the object of our hate. Due to the superego's structure, and part of it is a needed thing, unfortunately, when you magnify the imagos, you also magnify the power that kept you down. You start to admire it in a way and go, I want a piece of that. And then this is where things really become deeply neurotic, on another level, because you are now identifying with a necrophilist power, which then sets up this sort of master-slave dichotomy within yourself. Because there's another voice, the voice of conscience, that's screaming you for to not do that. So you must not suppress that. Plus, you must suppress the legitimate rage that you have to being violated. If you've been violated, it's right to be angry. It's right to be miserable. It's right to be depressed. But your parents don't allow you to do that. They're always, bum rushing you to get into the world. You don't even have time to process your own emotions. So you're a wreck. And so the young girls will start, becoming anorexic. The children become, sibling rivalry and all sorts of horrendous tics and idiosyncrasies, you see. Either too passive, because the only way to suppress rage is to suppress it so much you become completely docile, or you become a bully, the opposite, you see. But these opposites are connected. The bully is trying to exercise his rage, but he does it on weaker people in the schoolyard, when really his rage is towards his mother or father. But he knows that's taboo. You can't fight them. They'll kill you. They'll put you in a borstal. They'll have you medicated up the gazoo, right, as a delinquent. Yeah, there's so many factors here. And for everything we've talked about, you could unpack it endlessly. We haven't even talked about the role of dreams, for instance. We've barely touched on shadow work as it pertains to the human body. We in programs like this, we only have time to delve into, give hints of things. That's why I never really liked doing, podcasts through the years, because of these unenlightened hosts and the short time, or the fucking endless commercials, or the constant interruptions, whatever it may be. It just wasn't right. I had to really make some serious decisions, because I'm not a believer in talking down to people or cutting things up too small. To do that violates the content. I would rather not do that. I want to assume that the audience is the smart people and can digest this. That's why I proceed. And if the format's not right, that's all right. But then I ran into shadow banning as well. Don't forget that. Deplatforming multiple times. So I didn't expect that. And that's been going on in my life since about 2010. It's when it started to come down. Then I was attacked by, extremist Christians, right-wing Christian nutters. That went on for about 5-6 years. It was vehement. All my material was being flagged. And haven't I already mentioned to you that one of Freud's greatest enemies was the Catholic Church? The Christians were no lovers of psychoanalysis, you see. You find out how many enemies you've got. So my work was all pushed underground.
I feel as though, for some reason, could have to do with Trump. I don't have opinion on him one way or the other, but one thing I have noticed is that voices like yours are being allowed a platform in more public spaces again. So this is good, because I feel, I feel you're a sage in your own right, and that people need to hear what you have to say. So it's good that we have this opportunity to be able to do that here.
Right.
And I'll try my best not to interrupt so much
No,
because
no,
you do have important things to say. Yes.
no. This is really good. The earlier format just it didn't work for me in the years gone by. With a dial up, and some of them were very, very low grade. But it was okay. It was an apprenticeship. It's just I think that the information requires a certain kind of platform and a certain kind of host. And that's what we've got right now. And you're right. There's even other positive signs out there. Let's see how that holds up. We got to be very cautious, but at the same time, it could be a change for the better. But all I know is that for the last 10, maybe more years, there's been a war on the conservatives. They've been deplatformed, demonetized grossly for no reason. Income has been reduced to practically zero because of it. There's been serious consequences, through the COVID period as well. Wasn't very positive, but even before that. So we'll have to see how long that can last. I'm not holding my breath, but the work has to go on. So I'm very grateful to you, for putting these out and giving us a chance to streamline a lot of these ideas and these points. They're in a non-hurried way. I think that's what the big problem of the past was, that you had to say these things, but in a much more forced and hurried way. You only had a limited time. And I didn't particularly like that. So that's okay. We'll start again, do it again, in a different way. That's the good thing about it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I can't thank you enough for doing this, honestly, because these are issues that obviously, being a woman, I'm dealing with a lot of those. I've dealt with them throughout my life. A lot of things you spoke about in this particular episode too, just certain life experiences that can occur when you're trying to walk on a path of individuation, and the doors that can get slammed in your face, or the projection, or the gaslighting, or the scapegoating, and all of these things that can happen. And then the fight to be able to trust that you do actually have discernment inside of you that you can reestablish a relationship with. So the things that you talk about, because so few are speaking about it, this is why I'm just so glad that you're willing to go through this with me, that I get to ask questions about these things. And I hope that we can do more, because it seems like we're just getting started with the possibilities of where we can go with this.
Oh yeah, there's sure a lot more to go into. I always look at it as like it's a subject as time has come. We've spoken about how it's always been shoved into the background and other things made much more important. Like we just talked about adultism being somehow scrubbed. Yet it's from these politically correct people who are trying to address every injustice in the world, but they won't even address this one. See, so there you go. So then, okay, we'll address it, see how far it can take us. There's lots of ways to go here. And it all amounts to a very interesting manual. I just happen to find it very, very interesting. I don't find any of this controversial. I think it's very, very valuable. And that's why we opened with that original quote, which showed that when it comes to the male psyche, both the good side and the positive and the negative side, hey, everybody's on board at critiquing and dissecting the masculine and the male. But there is a really big imbalance. Woman has been getting off the hook for too long. She is never going to change. If you left it to women, we'd go for an eternity, and they still wouldn't change. It wouldn't budge an inch. Female psychology will never interest women. So obviously then, it has to be other people who bring it up and start to and make it. And most men are not that interested in it. We can see this from MGTOW. It's been going for a while now, and they're still in a very shallow place. So, we got to move forward. In the red pill people, they're good to a degree, right? The manosphere, all of that. Yeah, good indications. Some of them are better than others. But that still leaves a very big abscess that needs to be filled with a genuine subject that is part of the Western tradition. So when I talk about the Western philosophical tradition or Western magical tradition. This is part of it. This is psychology. And the great ones who worked on this, that's what they thought of. They thought they were contributing. See, Sigmund Freud and his followers and all, they were completely into Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, and Gustave Le Bon. They were reading the masters. They were addicts of the contemporaries, Oswald Spengler and all these names I could mention. So that's what they were doing. They were enamored by that. Always quoting these guys. Always quoting Kant, Immanuel Kant, and other philosophers. So we're just carrying on a tradition. This is not separate. This is not sort of a fringe thing at all. This is part of that very same tradition. And it's been subverted by these Eastern flunkies and their Western representatives, like Eckhart Tolle, Rhonda Byrne, all of this hybridized Eastern jive. Most of it needs to be trashed. It's just rubbish, high-priced rubbish. It's just repackaged magical child thinking. Like I said, ultimately regressive. And that's why ultimately regressive types go for it. Don't set up a stall and cater to these people who are just on a pit stop with a bunch of pretense to themselves, the self-deceptive one. If you make money out of them, like these Rhonda Byrnes and others do, these Marianne Williamsons, that's karma.
Yeah.
That's throwing money away. That's throwing them down a rabbit hole. Not a rabbit hole, down, that's down into a crevasse. They're not genuinely spiritual. They want the genuine fake because they're genuine fake. They're glutted on the world. They're not on any shamanic path, not even close. And all their antics to prove it is fake. So if you set up a stall and go, but I've learned commercially that they're in a good place, they'll buy some of this gear. They need the medicine wheels and the crystals and the tom-toms and the meditation mats and the leotards and all the other shite that goes with it, right? If you make money out of those people, you are a charlatan. You're defacing the Hermetic tradition. And it's because you haven't had the discernment yourself to tell these people. Like I told you, I had this opportunity, to follow along. I said no. But other people are doing that. I don't write my books for them. I don't produce any product for them. I'm very, very critical of the ones who do. And I pride myself on being able to spot these fakes, even if they have millions and millions of followers. I have not joined their teams. I've not, even when they whistled for me to come to them, I did not. There's many stories I could tell about that. You wouldn't believe it, half of it, So I just do my own thing, my own way, and try not to cater to those people. It's bad karma.
And with that, we bring this episode of The Dark Side of the Female Psyche to a close. There's still more to come in this series, so be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications to be notified when the next episode is ready. More social media accounts may be added in due time. If that interests you, bookmark willfullyevolvingwoman.com and check back periodically. If you would like to follow Michael and learn more from him, you can find his works through the following channels: dragonmother.org, femalepsychology.org, and of course, michaeltsarion.com. Michael also hosts a weekly podcast with David Whitehead. You can view the Unslaved podcast by becoming a member through unslaved.com or via the Unslaved Substack, substack.com/@unslaved. I'm Sarah DeHaven, and on behalf of Michael and myself, thank you for being here and thank you for listening. See you in the next episode.